Students, we will today discuss on ecological adaptations, and the topic on which we'll study the adaptations would be hydrophytes. As you all know, the living organisms, they live in the environment and they interact with the environment. And during adverse conditions in the environment, they develop such features so that they can withstand adverse conditions and can utilize the optimum from the environment with regards to the nutrition and their existence. And for this to happen, the plants, they develop certain features. It can be morphological, it can be anatomical, it can be reproductive and even physiological. Now, any such feature of an organism which will help it to grow and exist well in that particular habitat is called adaptation. Warming classified plants on the basis of nature of the soil. This was the first classification wherein he classified plants according to the requirement, like the plants growing in acidic soil, plants growing in saline soil, plants growing on surface of rocks, etc. In his second classification in the year 1909, he classified the plants on the basis of their water requirement and the water relationship. The amount of water required for the plants and the amount of transpiration that happens in a plant results in the difference in their forms and their life. So on the basis of the water requirement and the nature of soil, he classified plants as the hydrophytes or the aquatic plants, which would grow in or near water, the xerophytes, which are adapted to survive under the conditions of very poor availability of water, and the mesophytes, which would grow in an environment which is neither dry nor wet. These are some of the plant forms which grow according to the conditions of water. Let us now take up hydrophytes. The word hydrophytes come from two words, eudor, which is a Greek word and it means water, and phyton means plant. So hydrophytes are the plants which love to grow in water. Thus hydrophytes are the plants which will grow in wet places, or the plants which will grow completely submerged or partially submerged or partially in water. So depending upon their relationship to water and air, they have been categorized into 5 basic groups. And these are the free-floating hydrophytes, rooted hydrophytes with floating leaves, submerged floating hydrophytes, rooted submerged hydrophytes, rooted emergent hydrophytes. Now these are some of the examples of hydrophytes. Let us now take up the types of hydrophytes in brief. The free-floating hydrophytes, these are those hydrophytes which float freely on the surface of water but are not attached to the soil. But they will not be attached means they would not be rooted to the soil. The examples can be Ecornia, Pistia, Azolla. The next is the rooted hydrophytes but are with floating leaves. These are those hydrophytes which are rooted to the substratum. They are attached to the muddy substrata of pond, river, lakes, but the leaves and the flowering shoot will float on the surface of the water. They are grouped as floating but rooted hydrophytes. The examples, very common examples, Trappa, Nelambo, Nymphia, etc. This is the third group of hydrophytes, the submerged floating hydrophytes. These are those plants which grow below the water surface. They are not in contact with the atmosphere but are completely submerged under the water. The common example is Ceratophyllum, Nagus, etc. This is yet another group which is little different from the group that was taken up previously. These are submerged hydrophytes. They are also under the surface of water, but they are rooted to the soil. The common examples can be Vallisneria and Cara. These are the rooted emergent hydrophytes. These are those hydrophytes in which the roots of some parts of the plants are submerged in water or are buried deep into the mud, but some parts like the foliage, branches and some flowering shoot might come above the surface of the soil and may spread over the surface of the soil. Common examples that can be considered are Sagittaria, Scirpus, etc. Let us now take up the ecological adaptations in hydrophytes. It is observed that plants that thrive in aquatic environment are affected by three major factors, and these are the temperature of the water, the osmotic concentration of the water, and the toxicity of water. Even though these three factors affect the aquatic environment, but it is generally very uniform. The aquatic environment is generally very uniform. So the hydrophytes develop very limited adaptive features. And these adaptive features can be with respect to its morphology, the anatomy, or they can even be physiological features. Let us now take up the morphological adaptations. In case of roots in hydrophytes, the root system is very poorly developed. They may or may not be branched in submerged hydrophytes. The roots generally do not have lot of importance because the entire plant is in direct contact with water and the entire plant surface will absorb water and minerals. Thus, in most of the hydrophytes, the roots would be very poorly developed or may also be absent. In case of floating hydrophytes, the root hairs are not developed at all. In the floating hydrophytes, the true root caps are absent and they develop instead root pockets or root sheaths which protect their tips from any injury. The stems in the hydrophytes also show morphological adaptations. The stems are very delicate, they are inflated, and in many cases they are modified into rhizomes or runners. The morphological adaptations in leaves, depending upon the groups, show a wide range. In floating plants, the leaves are generally pelted, long, might be light or dark green in color, smooth. In certain plants, they show a typical character which is called heterophyly. For example, in Sagittaria, they develop two types of leaves. The leaves which are submerged are very thin, linear, highly dissected, and those which are found floating on the surface would be broad and maybe even lobed at times. In free-floating hydrophytes, the leaves are smooth, shining. They would have a coating of wax which would protect the leaves from any injury. In many cases, mostly in case of floating hydrophytes, the petioles will show a swelling. They will become swollen up, and this swollen up spongy character will provide buoyancy to the plants. In plants, the plants which are submerged, the leaves are generally very small and narrow. And in plants where they are partly submerged but with emergent leaves, they are exposed to the air, and in many cases they develop mesophytic characters. With respect to pollination and dispersal of fruits and seeds in hydrophytes, it is accomplished through the agency of water. They are very light in weight, and thus they can easily float on the surface of water. Mostly these plants propagate through vegetative propagation, where it happens through the phenomena of fragmentation of buds or even the shoots. After going through the morphological adaptations for hydrophytes, now let us look at some of the anatomical adaptations which are shown by this wide group of hydrophytes. Basically, the anatomical adaptations are with respect to reduction in the protecting structure, increase in aeration, reduction in mechanical tissue, and reduction or absence of vascular tissue. So when we speak of reduction in protecting tissue, it is observed that in most of the hydrophytes, the cuticle is totally absent. Even if it is present, it is present in form of a very thin film on the surface of the parts that are over the surface of the water or which is exposed to air. The epidermal cells also show very thin wall, and they have a very thin layer of cellulose, which generally help in absorption process. Most of the epidermal cells are filled up with chloroplasts. So besides being the outer cover for the organ, they also help in photosynthesis. In most of the cases, stomata is totally absent, and if it is present at all, it is present as a vestigial organ. So the gaseous exchange takes place directly through the cell walls. They are very, very limited in number, and in most of the cases, for example, like the plants where they have emergent leaves, the leaves are on the surface, they are present in the aerial parts, but they are scattered. Another very prominent feature with respect to the anatomical adaptation is the presence of wide amount of aerenchymatous tissue or the air chambers. Aerenchyma in submerged leaves and stems are very, very well developed. They are filled up with moisture and the respiratory gases. They are separated from each other by 1 or 2 cells thick partitions, and these partitions are again filled up with chloroplasts, so they can be called as chloroenchymatous partitions. The air chambers also develop perforated cross septas. These cross septas are known as diaphragm. They facilitate aeration and also helps in floating. The basic function of parenchyma, which is very prominent in the leaves, the stems, is to provide mechanical support to these aquatic plants and also to provide buoyancy. Parenchyma is not only limited to the stem and the leaves, but they are also present in the fruits. And there the main function is to help them in their dispersal. Moving further with the anatomical adaptations in hydrophytes, even in a petiole, we see the same prominent adaptations that were mentioned for root and stem, like the presence of air chambers with a partition wall, absence of cuticle, and thin-walled epidermal cells. Besides that, another prominent feature which is seen in almost all parts of the plant is the total absence or poorly developed mechanical tissue. Mechanical tissue, any thick-walled tissue like sclerenchyma is generally absent. But in plants with emergent plant parts like the leaf or stem, which is exposed on the surface of the body, have loosely arranged spongy cells. These thin-walled cells, when they are turgid, they provide the required mechanical support to the plant. Another typical feature with respect to the anatomical adaptation is the reduction in vascular tissue. Both xylem and phloem are very poorly developed. As absorption of water and nutrient takes place through the entire body of the plant, there is very little need of vascular tissue. In most of the cases, xylem shows great reduction. It is represented by a few tracheids, and in many cases it is not developed at all and is represented by a lacuna. So in such cases, those spaces or the lacuna can be considered a typical air chamber. Phloem is also poorly developed, but in some cases we see the phloem are represented by sieve tubes, which are smaller in size. But phloem parenchyma is extensively developed. Generally, the vascular bundles are aggregated towards the center, and in most of the cases, secondary growth does not take place in aquatic stem and the roots. The absence of mechanical tissue being a very prominent character, but again, the presence of a typical star-shaped structure in all the parts, the stem, leaf, is visible. These are known as astrosclerites, which are lignified cells, and the main function of these is to provide mechanical support to the plant. This shows a transverse section of leaf in nymphia, which again highlights the anatomical adaptations discussed so far. Now we come to the third section of our study on hydrophytes, and it deals with the physiological adaptations. These hydrophytes, they show some typical physiological adaptations. The plants, they exhibit a very low compensation point with a very low osmotic concentration of their cell sap, which is generally equal to or slightly higher than that of the water. These aquatic plants are subjected to less extremes of temperature as water is a bad conductor of heat. Hence, hydrophytes are generally less affected as far as transpiration is concerned. In many cases, the broad leaves which are found on the surface of the water, they do transpire, and they transpire actively. And in this way, they regulate the hydrostatic pressure of the plant body. The nutrients are absorbed by the submerged plants through the whole surface, the general surface of the plant body, and the gaseous exchange that takes place in the water, it takes place through the surface cells. And the gases that are produced during photosynthesis and respiration are stored in the air chambers of the parenchyma and are used as and when necessary. In most of the hydrophytes, there are mucilage cells, and these mucilage cells, they secrete a mucilage to protect the plant body from decay because of their being constantly underwater. Students, I have just provided you with a brief conceptual presentation on hydrophytes and their adaptations. You are now supposed to refer to different textbooks and do a further detailed study. Best wishes.